As we continue our series on Matthew 6, this week we take an in-depth look at the Lord's Prayer. We all struggle with the need for approval. Through the 7 petitions in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus points us to simplicity and aims our spiritual focus on the person of God and the need to surrender to His will. Here's Pastor Seth.
There is a core story that all of us live with, although we hardly even know what the storyline is. We sort of intuitively know what it is, but we don't really think it out all that well. We don't particularly lay it out and go after it intentionally. It's more of just there's a story in our heart, and we just sort of get up and go about our everyday business with that story leading the way. The story that we start out with is basically my story. And I'm the star of the play, the star of my story, and everybody else in my story is a supporting actor or some bit players, and I'm the director and the writer of my story. And all of my life, without me having even to think anything about this, is really built around telling my story. And that happens with every one of us. It happened with me every day last week, if I wasn't thinking about it. And thinking about, is that a story I want to really live out? God in His mercy comes to us and says, no, that's a bad idea. You do not want that to be the core story of your life. There's another story that is a much grander story of which you want to live. As human beings, what we do in this story is without even thinking about it, we just sort of live our story as if we know what it will be, so that we'll be the star of the show, will be fulfilled. For some of us, we start out with thinking that's our career. And when that doesn't quite do it, then we go to something like if we just had a promotion. And if that doesn't quite do it, then if we just had a really good marriage. And when that doesn't quite do it, we think, well, if we just added kids to this mix, that would do it. And if that doesn't do it, maybe achievement will do it. And maybe applause will do it. And maybe popularity will do it. And we just sort of go from thing to thing, hoping that there'll be something out there that will be the key to unlocking the plot of my story and driving home the central theme of my story, which is to make my life matter and to feel good about me. Now, at different times, we will then revert to when none of those good things, socially acceptable things work, then we will go outside the box and look for the socially unacceptable things to feel good about our story more immediately. Mostly because the pain is too great. Now, that is a story that is true of me. Unless God intervenes in my life and says, you are on the path of a train wreck. The real story is about me, God would say to us. I am telling a story that is grander than any small story, no matter how great and big you think your story may be. I am telling a grand story. I am the writer and producer and director, and my son is the star of the show. He's the headliner. And if you understand that, then you will have a supporting cast role or a bit player role. But in this story, bit player is not the same as unimportant. A bit player in this story has more value, more worth than the star of my story. If we do not make this connection, we will find ourselves just sort of flitting and flying from different thing to different thing, hoping that somehow we can make something work or some combination of things work to make my life work. And we were just not designed that way as human beings. Now, the psalmist has a cool way of saying this in a much shorter way than I just did. He says it's better is one day in your courts, meaning in your story, worshiping you. When I can see myself as a part of your story and that I'm included in that story, better is one day there than 1,000 elsewhere. And then he says, I would rather be a doorkeeper. I'd rather be a bit player in this story in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. And wicked can either be what we think of as wickedness incarnate, like we think of with ISIS, or it can be everyday evil. And everyday evil is something that I do and you do, whether we're aware of it or not. Anytime I put me before you, when I'm relating to you, that's everyday evil. God is trying to save me from that, to where I become somebody that in any given moment when I'm relating to you, I am more caught up with you and being a blessing to you than the blessing you could be to me. Now, these are the two stories. There is a core story. And as we look at the Lord's Prayer today, I really want you to keep that in mind. When Jesus tells these guys how to pray, it's not just like when I was in church growing up. We said the Lord's Prayer every week. And we just sort of, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be, just kind of rotated it through, for all these years. What he's trying to tell these guys is something like this. If I was you, and I was going to pray, here are the things I think would be worth mentioning. And in this, there's a small heading, a small closing, and 7 petitions. And they're all pretty short. It's very concise. It's not rocket science. But the idea is something like this. These are the skeletons of the core story that God is trying to build in us. You with me on this? You have what we're doing here? This is not a message about, when I go home, how should I pray? What are the right words to say? It's more like, how should I think about my life? What are the big pieces of the story here? And in light of that, how should I pray? All right, let's look at the prayer. The first part of this has to do with he focuses the attention on God's character, or really more specifically, on God's person. What kind of God, what kind of person, the person of God, are we praying to? The heading is, Our Father in heaven. Now, when he says in heaven, he's not saying location. If you get your GPS out, you'll find God in heaven. That's not what he's saying. He is giving us two sort of big theological pictures, what theologians call transcendence and immanence. Transcendence has to do with this word in heaven, meaning that God is ruler, he is king, he is sovereign. No matter how horrible the world may be on a global scale, or for you on a personal scale, our redemptive God is still going to use whatever it is in your life, whatever comes down the pike, redemptively in your life. God's rule doesn't mean that all of life just goes swimmingly. That's not the world we live in. That will be in heaven. Until then, God is a redemptive God that can use everything. That's the transcendence part. But then he also, when you pray, remember, you're praying to your heavenly Father. It's a very tender image. Now, it seems to me that in my life, I tend to sort of bounce from one to the other. Sometimes I think of God as sort of this big, sort of distant God who may or may not hear my prayers because they may not be all that important. They may not be all that important to me. They may not be all that important to him. And then other times, I tend to focus on sort of, or forget that God is my Father. That he really cares about me. Even the smallest things in my life, he's aware of. Just like any father worth his salt is aware of all the important things and all the details in their son or daughter's life. So as he tells us how to pray, he says, remember who you're praying to. He is both transcendent, the ruler of the universe, and your daddy at the same time. He's intimately involved with you and cares about what you pray. Then, that's the heading. Then he starts with petition number 1. Hallowed be thy name. The word hallowed is a word we don't use very much, but it means to consider as holy, or to honor, or to give due reverence to. The idea is related to our core story idea, is something of God is telling not just a big story, but a wondrous story. And I want to be a part of that. Someday in heaven, when I look back, I'll be able to look back on this earth and I'll go, wow. You mean you were able to use even that in my life? And that in my life? And times when I thought, where are you? And how come you haven't answered this particular prayer? I'll probably be able to look back and go, oh, okay, would you pass me a piece of humble pie and a fork, please? This is petition number 1. I have to tell you, it's not usually petition number 1 in Seth's prayer life. But it ought to be. Hallowed be your name. May your name be honored in my life, and may it be honored through my life, is the idea here. And then on the inside of your handout, we come to petition 2 and 3. And here, what he does is he focuses us on the big story. And he has 2 sort of railroad tracks that drive the story. And the prayer is essentially, Lord, get me on those railroad tracks. They're very simple petitions. The first is, thy kingdom come. What is God's kingdom? Is this like the United Kingdom? It's like the kingdom of Saudi Arabia? This is a kingdom without borders and without boundaries. You can't find this on a map. You can find kingdom citizens. Some of them are sitting in this room. Wherever you find God as king of somebody's life, that is a kingdom citizen. And our role as kingdom citizens is not just to make my life happy and fulfilled. My role as a part of the core story is to take his kingdom and try to drive it forward through my life into the lives of people that he has put around me. When we pray, thy kingdom come, we're not just praying some theological thing. We're praying, God, would you use me in this endeavor? And then he says, petition number 3, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, you've noticed that this life is not heaven. And I continue to be amazed at people who reject God on this particular basis. I do not believe in a God who would allow this kind of suffering in our world. And therefore God must not exist. If you are looking for evidence of God's goodness, the last thing you're going to do is look at the news. That's a terrible place to go looking for evidence about the goodness of God. Here, Jesus assumes thy will be done here on earth because it's a mess. There's something wrong. There's something that needs to be fixed. And what he wants to do is use you and I as agents of change to bring about something of the life that goes on in heaven, the relationships that will go on there one day, down through you, out to the people around you. The focusing of God's story. He starts with the focusing on God's person, and then God's story. Third, the anchoring of daily life. He goes from sort of the big picture of who God is, big story, and now he just kind of goes back to everyday life. And a couple of petitions here. Petition 4, give us this day our daily bread. Now, I remember praying this prayer every Sunday in our church growing up, and I was sort of mystified about this because my dad had a good job and we had a good income. And it was almost like, was that really important to pray that particular petition? It was almost like you could skip over it. But over time, there's more in this little verse than one might think. Because he doesn't just say, give us our bread. Give us this day our daily bread. Now, what's that about? What does that tell us? Sometimes we think, well, God isn't interested in the details of my life. He doesn't care about, I don't know. Is that really true? I think he adds this day and daily bread because he delights in our involvement with him. He wants you to come to him. Just like any father, when he comes home from work, wants his kids to come running to the front door with sheer delight. He could just say, Okay, well, get a job, and once you got your job, you're good. Don't worry about that. There's something of God's heart and his desire to engage with us as his children and to know him as our Father. I think about this in terms of two ways. He wants us to learn how to be delightfully dependent. Delightfully dependent on him. And to know that we are richly wanted every day. Every day. He mentions it twice, just in case we might miss that. Give us this day our daily bread. Petition 5, forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Now, I suppose that of all the petitions in this particular prayer, the ones that my secular friends would say is the least useful is this one. Because among most of my secular friends, if you ask them about is there a need for forgiveness, they may not say it this way, but the predominant belief in our culture is if my good outweighs my bad, then that's all I need to entrance into heaven. There's really not a need for forgiveness. I just need to make sure that my moral good things outweigh my moral failures. Now, from beginning to end in the Bible nowhere, ever, at all, says that's possible. In fact, it says the opposite is true. It says it's impossible. No matter how you may see yourself and how good you may see yourself, to ever let your deeds outweigh the bad things that you may not be able to see with crystal clarity with all the good things you can see. We live in a world where we are moral failures. Now, not just on the big scale, but in everyday evil. This past week, I had several very challenging situations where I was involved in, and the challenge to choose someone else as more important than me, and when I was relating to them, I found a very difficult fight. A battle was raging in me. I wanted this moment to be about me. That's everyday evil. What God is trying to do is make me a person where I'm more conscious of you than I am of me, and what's going on inside of you than what's going on inside of me. Now, one of the things that I wonder about with this forgiveness thing is why is forgiveness so important to God? Well, I think one reason why it's so important is because what it requires of somebody is humility. To simply say, God, I have sinned. I disobeyed you. And that was wrong. Now, it's not just that I am clearing a record, but that requires some amount of humility that over the course of a lot of years starts to affect how I see my world, how I see God, how I see myself, and how I see you. It begins to sort of flow over into my relationships. Or hopefully, over years, some of you that have known me a long time, hopefully you sense more humility as I relate to you than you did 10, 20 years ago. It's that humility in relationship that is sort of like the oil. It sort of makes the whole thing work a whole lot better, a lot smoother. We call that love and enjoyment of one another. Humility. Then he talks about the weapons of daily battles with two simple petitions. Number 6, lead us not into temptation. I have been a Christian 42 years, became a Christian my junior year at Baylor, right after Christmas, my junior year, at a midwinter retreat. 42 years. I am amazed at how much every day I still have to battle temptation. And sometimes it seems like that's all I do. It just seems just like I am just allured to go in different directions, and sometimes it doesn't seem like it would take all that much for me to make a fatal choice and to bring ruin upon myself, my name, upon my family, upon our church, upon my friends, my extended family. James says this should not surprise us when we are tempted like this. I like how James put this. Each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Now, here in this verse, he sort of outlines for us what are the different pieces of how temptation works. It starts out with thought, dropped into the head. Now, sometimes that thought is mine. Sometimes that thought is Satan's. It doesn't really matter where that originated in the final analysis. The point is not to figure out where the thought came. The point is, uh-oh. Now, a simple evil thought then morphs into a strong imagination or impression that's made on the imagination by the thing to which we are tempted. This thought gets a life of its own in our head. There's a picture, a story, and that story sort of woos us in a direction. Number 3, we sort of delight in viewing that. Now, all this can happen within our head, or it can happen out when we're with people. There's some kind of delight going on inside of me. Then I'm toying with the thought and maybe enjoying the desire all by myself, and perhaps nobody knows this is going on while this is happening with moi. And then the consent of the will to perform it, and at this point, if I'm in a public setting, this is finally what's seen. You think, oh, Seth, you are a moron. What you don't see is that there were 5 things before that. And that at all 5 of those stages, there was a moral failure to deal with each one of those. It started with a simple thought. It ended with a rattlesnake bite. The place to deal with temptation is not when the rattlesnake is standing right in front of me, hissing. The place to deal with it is way out there, way before I can see when I first see the rattlesnake, and to move away from it. That's petition number 6. Lord, lead us not into temptation. Help us to see this thing for what it is. It's not a treasure. It's a rattlesnake. Number 7, deliver us from evil. Now, I think this is sort of one of those umbrella prayers that has a lot of applications to it. Deliver us from the evil of terrorism. Deliver us from the evil of somebody breaking into our home and wanting to do great harm to my family. Deliver us from the evil that is latent within me and could cause great damage. Deliver us from evil from what the choices others could make that would bring great harm upon us. I think for me, the biggest one is deliver me from everyday evil. Somehow do your work of making my life a part of your story, and that others are more important at any given moment when I'm relating to them than me. Deliver us from evil. That's petition 7. And then finally, the closing. And the closing sounds a whole lot like the heading. For thine is the kingdom, power, the glory forever and ever. He reminds us, again, back to one of the petitions, thine is the kingdom. This is the central purpose of life. It's the core of the core story, being a part of his kingdom. Help me to be a part of his kingdom. Then he says, and the power, meaning I will not be a part of this story left to myself without your power, because naturally I'm going to keep going right back over here to my story. I need your power to be a part of this story and to say no to self and yes to the people who happen to be in front of me, whether it's one person or several people at a meeting. And then he finishes with, and the glory. That may be the most important part of the whole prayer. Because what is native to us in our sinful nature is we want the glory. We want people to go, oh, isn't that guy's so wonderful. Oh, he's so impressive. That's great. That's what we want. And God says to us, that's a bad idea. The purpose is his glory, to shine the light on Jesus Christ and on the cross and the resurrection and his work in me day by day by day, his continued pursuit of me and trying to mold me into his character. That is the central story. And one day in heaven, it will be crystal clear. Why, of course, look at the wonder of what you've created in your people. And we will rightly give him glory and honor. Now, some of God's people saw this. And they saw this glory thing as not just a small piece. Notice what they prayed. This is from Psalm 115. Here's their prayer. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to thy name give glory for the sake of thy steadfast love and thy faithfulness. They saw trying to make life about being the star of the show as a rattlesnake. That's a bad idea. Lord, deliver us from that. Please. Mentions it twice. Please don't let us be like that. For the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness, verse 2, why should the nations say, where is their God? In other words, if we make life about ourselves, we can be pretty sure that nobody's going to say, that guy worships God, doesn't he? I think I see some connection there between his life, her life, how they relate. There's something different that doesn't have to do with them that's intriguing. Isaiah 42:5, thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people and spirit to those who walk in it. That's the setting of the story. Verse 6, I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. He's the director, the producer. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. He's the star of the show. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. We play a role. Even a bit player role is of more value than being the star of the show over here. I have given you as a covenant to the people, light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord. That is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to graven images. A core story. Are you living out your story? That's our default. Don't be surprised if you are. Should not shock anyone. But that's not where life is. Life is over here. Remembering God's person and his story. Being anchored in what he wants to do, relate to us in everyday life, and arm us for the battles, and then a reminder of his kingdom, his purpose, his power, and his glory, my life. About 400 years ago, a really neat Christian man wrote a poem. I love this poem. Once on a time, a paper kite had mounted to a wondrous height, where giddy with its elevation, it thus expressed self-admiration. See how yon crowds of gazing people admire my flight above the steeple. How would they wonder if they knew all that a kite like me could do? Were I but free, I'd take flight and pierce the clouds beyond their sight. But like a poor prisoner, bound, my string confines me to the ground. I'd brave the eagle's towering wing. Might I but fly without a string. It tugged and it pulled, while thus it spoke, to break the string. At last, it broke. Deprived at once of all its stay. In vain, it tried to soar away. Unable its own weight to bear, it fluttered downward through the air. Unable its own course to guide, the wind soon plunged it in the tide. Foolish kite, thou hadst no wing. How couldst thou fly without a string? My heart replied, O Lord, I see how much this kite resembles me. forgetful that by thee I stand, impatient of thy ruling hand. How oft I'd wish to break the lines thy wisdom for my lot assigns. How oft indulged a vain desire for something more, something higher, and but for grace and love divine, a fall thus dreadful would have been mine. Let's pray together. Father, we ask you to open our eyes to the truth about you and the truth about life and the truth about ourselves. Help us to freely acknowledge what should be apparent to us, but apparently isn't. That we err gravely when we make our life about our story. We do that without even thinking about it. I don't have to give that any thought. Don't have to plan my day around that. It's just going to be that way unless I stop and say, I don't want to be like that. Lord, draw me into your story. Remind me of who you are as transcendent ruler and Father. And bring me into your character and your story. Remind me of your story. Help us to see your delight in us as your children. Help us to come running to you each day, much like we did when we were little and our fathers came home. There's no father like that except you. And arm us for our daily battles. And draw us back to your core story for our lives.
We invite you to come worship with us every Sunday at 9:30 in Irvine, California. And you can visit our website at pacificchurch.com to learn more about upcoming sermon series and our church family.